So now here's the thing also. We need to think about this issue. I think if I was to ask most students, do you think democracy is good? Students would say yes, right? And if I was follow up with the question, why is democracy good? I think most people would say, well, democracy gives us freedom. In democracy, we have rights. And I think that's a good answer. And I want to point out, under the Athenian democracy, some of the rights that they had are rights that are recognizable to us. For example, equality before the law. We mentioned that. The law doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care who your parents are. It doesn't care what class you are, ideally. What it cares is, did you commit the crime or not? Or are you following the rules or not? They also had what they called equality of speech, which basically meant anyone, any free citizen, had the right to address the assembly. One thing you have to remember, these city-states are small. So you could have several thousand people get together, and any one of those people who wanted to had the right to speak. You could just be some poor guy, but if you were a citizen, you had the right to speak. And that's very important. And I think, again, like I said, it's a small size. You would never develop this in Persia. It's too big. But in a small city-state, you can develop a kind of face-to-face democratic idea. In addition, there was an understanding that you had the capacity to speak freely. So it's not simply that you had the right to speak. You also couldn't be punished for what you had to say. You had the right to disagree. You could say to a powerful person, I think you're wrong. And that powerful person can't have you arrested. That's very different from how things were in, say, Persia, right? You could get in a lot of trouble if you went against the Persian emperor, just speaking against. And one thing I think is really striking was that they had the right to audit officials. What this meant was, after you were an official, right? You may win the lottery, you may become like an official, and when you were done, people could check to make sure you had not been corrupt, to make sure that you had not, say, taken money out of the state treasury and spent it to buy yourself a new house. They could check that. So I think that's one thing that makes democracy good. And I think if I were to ask students what makes democracy good, they would say that. But there's a few other things I would add that maybe people wouldn't necessarily say. One is, I would argue that democracy brings stability. You may say, well, how's that? Well, imagine this. You're in a country ruled by a king who claims to have power from the gods, who claims to speak for the gods, and the king wants to do something. How can you disagree with the king? What if the king is wrong, or what if what the king wants to do hurts you? So you either have to go along with the king, or you have to conspire and launch a rebellion, or you may want to assassinate the king. Right? That's the problem. When one person tries to control all the power, if people want to oppose that person, they may have very good reason for opposing the person, because the person may be wrong. Their only option is to fight or rebel or kill them. But with democracy, where people can speak freely and have the right to speak, they can say, I think this policy is wrong, and here's why. And if they can convince people that the policy is wrong, then the policy will not be implicated or will not be followed. Right? So the key thing is, in democracy, you can have compromise. People can talk about their issues, talk about their disagreements, and resolve them. And in so doing, right, they can deal with the problem and not have a rebellion or fighting or anything like that. And I would argue, and this flows from the idea of stability, this makes you strong. Remember, Sparta was afraid to move its army out of Sparta because of the fear of slave rebellion. Now that's an extreme case, but if you have an unstable country, your army has to stay in the city because you're afraid that people are going to rebel. You're afraid people are going to fight. But if things are stable at home, you can leave. Right? And you can do things other than worry about how do you prevent people from rebelling. Right? If you're always worried about people rebelling, you can't really do much other than focus on preventing them from rebelling. But democracy, by bringing stability, gives you the strength, the power to do other things. Now, one thing I should stress also that people now would say is good about democracy, I think is, well, they say it's equality. Now, what's tricky with the Greeks, of course, is this issue of who is equal. In order to be equal, right, to be part of the democracy, you had to be a man, You had to at least be 20 years old. You had to at least completed your military training. And of course, you had to be free and a free citizen. So if you were a woman or a slave or were too young, you were excluded. If you didn't have the money for military service, you could be excluded. So I want to stress, this is a first kind of step forward towards democracy, but it's not where we would like to be. Right? So when I talk about Athens and Athenian democracy, I admire it, but it's not perfect. Right? It's not where we want to be. It's a little bit too exclusive, or a lot too exclusive, I should say. And I should point out one thing, and we'll talk more about this as time goes on, the Greeks were really looked down on people who weren't Greeks. If you weren't a Greek, you were what's called a barbarian. And that comes because the Greeks said basically that the barbarians, when they talked, it just sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. So basically they were calling people who weren't Greeks blah, 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 because they couldn't understand them, because those people didn't speak the only civilized language, which is Greek. So there was also kind of cultural chauvinism here. But the thing is, faults aside, what happened was democracy helped build strong, stable, integrated community in Athens that could generally manage conflict well and work for the good of everyone, or at least the people who actually had a political voice in the democracy. Right? They built a strong, stable, integrated community that can manage conflict and work for a common purpose together, so they can accomplish a lot. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it is an important step towards the freedoms we now enjoy. Right? So it's a step in the right direction, even if it's not perfect. And I just want to stress, what's great about democracy is even though democracies are never perfect, they have the power through compromise and their stability to bring change peacefully. Right? So one thing that's cool about democracy is you don't have to have a civil war necessarily, or rebellion or assassinations to bring change. You can do it peacefully. So if the democracy is too restrictive, for example, like Athens, eventually you could have peaceful change that will extend rights to more and more people. That happens more in the Roman Republic, which we'll talk about in another section. But I just want to point out one of the strengths of democracy is it can change peacefully. Now we need to talk about the military. And this may seem kind of odd to us because oftentimes we tend to put military societies and democratic societies against each other. And that's not how ancient democratic governments worked. Actually, military and democracy went together for them. And in order to talk about that, though, I need to briefly talk about the hoplite infantry. Or I believe it's actually called hoplite, but I'm going to call it hoplite because that's what generally people call it. But the hoplite infantry, this is an example of a hoplite infantryman. He's got armor, he's got his spear, he's got a big shield, and he has a heavy metal helmet. So one thing I have to point out, and I'll mention this more at the Phalanx, this kind of infantry is awesome. Oh, and he also has shin guards, greaves. This kind of infantry is awesome, very, very powerful. It is very effective, but wow, is it expensive. Wow, is it expensive. So you may say, well, geez, they must have had to pay a lot of taxes in Athens to pay for that. Nope, because the costs were borne by the soldier. So in the Athenian military, and this is normal for Greece, the costs of fighting, the cost of the soldiers being equipped is borne by the soldier. Right? That's the one who pays, who does this. So this means that only relatively wealthy men can be soldiers or can at least be hoplite infantry. Only those who completed military service could participate in the democracy. So like I said, there is something limiting about this democracy because you had to, like, say, be a free man who could do military service, and doing military service isn't showing up and being given equipment. You have to provide your own. Now, a lot of times I should point out this military equipment would be handed down from father to son. So you may be fighting like in your great-grandfather's helmet, but it's still expensive, right? It's still expensive. So only those who completed their military service could participate in democracy. So that means there was a close connection here between wealth, military service, politics, and power. You had to be wealthy to do military, or relatively wealthy to do military service. You basically had to be like middle class. And by doing your military service, you could become involved in politics. And all citizens were expected to be involved in politics. It's not something for professional politicians. And that is where power came from. Now, there was equality in Greece and Athens, but it was among a certain class, citizens, the people who had males who of a certain age who had done their military service. Now, again, this is problematic, but one thing I'll say in defense of the system is that the people who decide to go to the war are typically the same people who fight the war. Right? The people who go to war are typically the same people who fight the war. And I think that's very, very important. That's something we have to emphasize. And what this means is that the people who are actually doing the fighting are there because they wanted to be there. Right? This isn't like conscripts. If you're not familiar with the conscript, a conscript is someone who goes to war because a government told them to go to war. So if you're a man of at least 18 years old in the United States, right, you have to sign up for the draft. That's signing up to be conscripted if the government needs you. So you may be sent to a war and you had nothing to do with whether or not, you don't have a choice of whether or not to go because the government tells you you're going. You maybe didn't have a choice in our decision to fight that war. But theoretically speaking, at least, Greek hoplite soldiers went to war by choice. They were the ones voting whether or not to go to war. Right? I should point out, even after you completed your military service, until you were age 60, you could be called up to fight. And so typically what you had with hoplites, these were patriots who were fighting out of love of country because they chose to fight. So they're naturally going to fight harder. Right? And you think about it this way, you have one soldier who is there because he has to be. He was told by the king, you're going to go fight in this war. And you have one soldier who's there because he chose to, because he thought it was in the best interest of his community. Well, you can guess that second soldier is going to be more braver and fight better than that first soldier. First soldier is going to run away if things go bad, whereas the Greek soldier who's there for patriotism is probably going to keep fighting. Now, I don't want you to think that the hoplites fought on their own as individuals. They fought in a group. They fought in a formation called a phalanx, and this is a phalanx right here. You can see, like I said, they're in a formation. Typically, it was about 8 men deep, but it could be shorter if it was necessary. And the idea was it would go forward and crash into another phalanx. And you can see that there were some, that this is a good formation in many ways. It would be very easy if the enemy came from here for them just to rotate their spears and turn around. It's really hard, unless you attack from all sides at once, to actually deal with these guys. So this is a very powerful formation. And on flat ground, it was almost unbeatable. In other forms of terrain, it maybe didn't work so well, but on flat ground, it was almost impossible to defeat. And except by another hoplite force. So, and one reason why it has so many people deep, and maybe like, what are these guys doing here? They can't actually wield their spears. They're too far back. Well, they can replace these guys in front if they should die, if they should be wounded. And they also kind of add weight to like a charge or something like that. They also make it harder for the people behind them, or the people in front, to turn around and run away. If anyone's going to run first, it's going to be these guys. A lot of times you put your best soldiers actually in the back. They were least likely to run away. And this man here is playing a flute to keep time. The faster he plays, the faster the phalanx will go. Now, like I said, this is very important to understand because it's key to why the Greeks will win some battles later on that we'll talk about. But I want to emphasize that there is a connection between Greek democracy and the military. I think this highlights it. Greek democracy was not so much based around the individual, it was based around the group. Greek democracy was based around forming a group that could work effectively for the good of all. And you see that in a phalanx. This is a group of highly trained soldiers, but they're citizen soldiers. They are going to know each other. They are going to have participated in political endeavors together. They maybe didn't always agree, but all of them, agree or disagree, at their heart wanted what was best for Athens. And that allowed them to fight very effectively together and to fight very bravely together. And that gave them a lot of power. So like I said, when you think democracy, think freedom. There's a lot of freedom in democracy, but we also have strength and stability and all those other wonderful things that come out of it. But like I said, it's a democratic society, I think, that can make for an effective phalanx like this.